You sent me the worst philosophy takes that you have ever come across so that I can tie myself in knots attempting to defend them. So, let's get started. First up, the top comment is from Coffee446, and this is their worst philosophy take that they've ever heard. Why would you want privacy if you've got nothing to hide? So, of course, this is a classic totalitarian dictum, I suppose, whereby the justification for a surveillance state is that, well, if you object to this, then clearly you're worried about the discovery of some nefarious action you've committed or some forbidden belief that you have. One of the reasons why I think that it's such a poor argument is because I think we really underestimate the extent to which privacy is important for building a whole host of other social goods. I mean, trust is the paradigm example of this, and Byung-Chul talks about this quite a lot in the Transparency Society, which I've definitely talked about on the channel before. So one of the points that he brings up is that trust is, in some ways, the belief that even when someone is not being watched, they still won't do you any harm, right? And that harm can be cashed out in a variety of ways, right? If you confide some sort of secret information in a friend and then they share it with someone else, then that's them doing you harm by betraying your trust, right? So we're construing harm in quite a broad sense here. But effectively, Hahn points out that if everyone's being watched and everyone knows they're being watched, this almost necessarily prevents the development of trust, because we never find out how someone would behave if they weren't being watched, because they always are being watched. And to a certain extent, this is the death blow of a society, right? If there is so little trust in everyone around you that you literally cannot bear to let them go unobserved, then I don't know in what sense this is a community. It just seems like this scattering of individuals, each of which basically hate one another and who can't bear to let the other go unobserved for even a second. Another thing is that it almost, again, by consequence of this lack of trust and constant observation, means that you can't really forge a connection with another person, right? Because one of the things about friendships and connections with other people more generally is that we have positive beliefs about what they feel in their internal world, right? So when I think about some of my close friends, one of the beliefs that I have about their internal reality is that they think quite fondly of me, right? That they in some sense want the best for me. And this is one of the reasons why, say you find out that one of your friends is gossiping about you behind your back. I think that's one of the reasons it hurts so much, is because it undermines this belief that you have about their specifically private and internal friendliness towards you. And of course, if you don't have privacy, then you can't have that. I think that this is a really interesting irony, right? Is because oftentimes lack of privacy is billed as bringing people closer together. This idea that, okay, we'll all know everything about one another, we're all transparent, and so we all know one another much better in some sense. But I don't think that's true. If everyone is being observed, then if anything, this incentivizes people to hide their kind of true internal landscape, for want of a better word, and instead simply present this outer sheen, whether or not that reflects anything they genuinely feel about reality and the other people around them. And that kind of sounds like you can't have friendship then, right? If I literally can never trust my friend to express their candid feelings, then I don't know in what sense that can be called a friendship. I think this is one of the reasons why, and this is just to be spitballing, I think this is one of the reasons why celebrities probably struggle to have friends, right? Because to a certain extent, everyone would want something from you. Taylor Swift is like the biggest pop star in the world, right? And as a result, she holds an awful lot of power in that domain. And I always think that must come with this underlying fear that no one's ever really being honest with you. They might just be buttering you up for something. And I think that in a world without privacy, none of us have any kind of reliable access to one another's internal states because they'll just keep them hidden. So despite a lack of privacy often being billed as a way to bring a community closer together, to be kind of more transparent or more accountable is another phrase that's often used, I actually think that far from bringing them closer together, a total lack of privacy would almost isolate everyone in their own little bubbles. And, you know, you see this in totalitarian literature. In 1984, basically nobody ever knows what anyone else is feeling, and there is no such thing as friendship, and nobody can trust one another. And I think that this is both one of the stated reasons for Big Brother to be watching everyone, because they can't trust them, but it's also a consequence of being watched. And I think that this has the potential to have quite a dangerous feedback loop. But anyway, enough for criticizing. The situation where I think that you could defend some kind of loose version of this doctrine is if the person you're telling it to is someone that you genuinely think means you harm. In that circumstance, the whole basis on which privacy is allowed totally disintegrates. And you see that this is actually when people disallow privacy towards one another. So say two countries are at war. They don't allow one another privacy, right? They're spying, they're collecting information because they believe that the other country, in this case, they're probably right if they're at war, they believe that the other country means them direct harm. That's my best job at defending something like this, but that's also not the context in which it's often given. So I think I've arguably done quite a bad job there. So if your community does start reasoning along the lines of, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, that's a pretty bad warning sign. Something has gone very badly wrong in the trust relationships in that society if people start to think that nobody can be entitled to privacy or else they personally feel threatened. But anyway, moving on. Okay, next we have a comment from Ben Conroy 9734, and his worst philosophical take is, everything happens for a reason. I remember hearing someone use this phrase when discussing a young guy in my area who'd been killed in a car crash, and I thought it was such a strange way of looking at the situation and also kind of dismissive of the grief so many of his family and friends were feeling. Yeah, I can see how that would be upsetting. Funnily enough, and it kind of seems quite crude to talk about the history of philosophy when it comes to a personal tragedy, but Albert Camus touches upon this point quite heavily in The Plague. He has this subplot with Father Panlu, which I think is how you pronounce that. And his reaction to this devastating plague that's absolutely sweeping this town is to say, this is because we live in sin. This is a punishment from God. This is happening for a reason. And Camus really attacks this. He thinks that this idea that everything necessarily happens for a reason ultimately leads to bizarre consequences. So Father Panlu has a kind of existential crisis when a young child is dying of the plague. And Dr. Ryu says, tell me that this innocent child deserved to suffer and die because they were sinful. And Father Panlu kind of can't. He actually says this is a humiliating experience, and he ends up trusting God anyway. But this is Camus' response to this kind of attitude towards reality. It's one of the critiques he has about thinking that the universe has inherent meaning. He thinks that if you think that the universe has inherent meaning, and you think that everything does happen in line with this universal teleology, then you end up saying that all of these awful things that happen are for the best in some sense. It becomes a kind of Voltaire-like critique of not necessarily that we live in the best of all possible worlds, but that we live in a world whereby everything is meaningful and there is no such thing as pointless or absurd suffering. Camus sort of basically goes, sometimes the more compassionate thing is to acknowledge meaningless suffering, because if you don't, then you kind of end up saying, oh, man, I'm sorry that your kid's dead, but everything happens for a reason. And that strikes Camus as basically heartless. But at the same time, you do see relatively sensible people say something like everything happens for a reason. And I think that sometimes this occurs because we're running together reason and cause. So the statement everything happens for a cause is just kind of determinism. In fact, it's less than determinism, because you could think that one of the causes are people's wills, right? And you could still believe in libertarian free will and still think that everything happens for a cause. It's just that you think that those causes aren't deterministic. But this is a significantly more modest idea than the idea that everything happens for a reason. You sometimes see when people discuss this, they run the two together. And I think the best way to cash out the difference is that this causal story doesn't indicate any kind of teleology. It doesn't have any normativity. There is no way that things ought to be. There's just the way that things happen to be, and the idea that whatever has happened is explicable in terms of causal stories, which doesn't have this implication that tragedies are good or in some sense inherently meaningful. The reason-based story, on the other hand, sort of does. It suggests that everything is in some way shaping up for the best. I mean, a kind of interesting middle ground position, or not middle ground position, but a kind of orthogonal position, I suppose, would be something like Gnosticism, where in some variants, everything happens for a reason, but it's a crap reason. It's a demiurge or archon-based reason, and actually, you want to get away from those particular reasons for things happening. I think that's an interesting perspective, and it's one that kind of doesn't often get explored, partly because I think that if you think that everything happens for a reason, then chances are you're probably some kind of theist, or if not, an intensely spiritual person. And because Gnosticism never caught on, really, we have this conflation between the idea of agential powers that affect things in the universe and goodness. But I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you're a Gnostic, because then you could say this horrible event happened for a reason and you should be even more mad about it because it was a malicious reason. It wasn't simply blind forces. This happened because of an agent's fault. But in practice, you don't get that position put forward very often, which in some ways is very odd, right? Because we all know that tragic things happen. And I sometimes do think if we do have this hankering for intentionality or hankering for an agential force behind the universe, why is it that there aren't more people who fall into some kind of Gnosticism? An interesting alternative hypothesis that has recently been put forward by Philip Goff is that God exists but is of limited power, which I think is quite fun. If you are going to say that everything happens for a reason, I think that you basically have to be some kind of theist or be heavily into spirituality. And moreover, I think that a more defensible version of that is to say that there might be reasoned agents who nonetheless do evil things. And I suppose you could fit this into Christian cosmology with some sense of the demonic or the satanic, which I suppose is what people often do when they're confronted with evil actions on a omnitheistic worldview. You know, this kind of idea that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and so you have the problem of evil. People have historically quite often turned to demonic explanations for that. So I suppose that might be able to rescue this idea. But in some sense, you've really changed the proposition because it's no longer everything happens for a brackets good reason. It's just everything happens for a reason, and the reason might be terrible. Okay, next we have a comment from MagicMark3309, and his worst philosophical take is, it's just common sense. Not really a philosophy, but probably one of the worst concept-stroke phrases to be uttered. I think that you can make a defense of some common sense. It kind of depends how you define common sense. I think of common sense as a mixture of what somebody's inherited from just the worldview that they were brought up in, which I suppose is only really defensible if you already agree with that worldview. But secondly, I think that common sense can be the implicit or semi-conscious generalizations that you make from your own everyday experience, which is sometimes really, really handy, right? At its best, that can bear a passing resemblance to what Aristotle called phronesis, or practical wisdom, which is knowing what virtues to apply in what situation, or even just the concept of a skill. So one of my friends is a very, very good builder, right? He works in construction. He's worked in it for years. He seems to know pretty much everything about it, or at the very least, an awful lot about it. And I would wager that in the domain of construction and construction sites and building, his common sense is going to be something you want to listen to very, very carefully, because it's been crafted in that base of experiences. He's saying, no, like I've been doing this for over 10 years now. I know what I'm talking about. And I think that that kind of common sense is perfectly fine. Likewise, if you've lived in a town all your life, your common sense might be very well attuned to the kind of things that happen in that town. I think that when someone says it's just common sense and it kind of rubs people up the wrong way is when this limited sample size of your just general everyday experience is then used to infer huge things about reality and disparate fields that aren't in the observational base in which that common sense was crafted. So I think the really good example of this is my common sense made me very, very confident before I knew anything about Gödel's incompleteness theorem or anything like that. It made me very, very confident that you would be able to create a complete and consistent system for mathematics. That seemed so intuitive to me. It almost seemed like common sense, because when I use reasoning out in the world, you can use it consistently. It doesn't seem like logic itself gets mired in contradictions, even if people make contradictions. And it seems like these classical rules could never lead you astray, no matter what objects you're dealing with. And something that, Gödel showed with his incompleteness theorem is that anything stronger than Robinson arithmetic, which is just a very particular definition of arithmetic that's slightly weaker than piano arithmetic, cannot prove its own consistency. And this blew my little 18-year-old mind, because I just thought, this cannot be. This feels so unintuitive. And I went through and I kind of picked apart the proofs a little bit later when I had a bit more of a grounding in logic. And I was like, oh God, no, this is definitely true. I mean, it's an absolutely beautiful proof if anyone wants to look through. And it also completely flies in the face of my common sense ideas about logic and reasoning. And I think that there are quite a lot of discoveries like that. Another one is Euclidean geometry, or non-Euclidean geometry, I should say. It strikes me as such common sense that Euclidean geometry would just be the geometry of the universe, because in the world of middle-sized objects, it works so well. But then you get to massive objects in the world of general relativity theory, and it just breaks down. That's a classic example of, in both cases, actually, is a classic example of your common sense being stretched beyond its epistemic warrant. My ideas about reasoning necessarily being consistent and complete was crafted in the world of everyday reasoning. Then when I took it to something like second-order logic or piano arithmetic, where these systems are incomplete, there are a couple of logical systems that are complete, so propositional logic and first-order logic is complete, and various other subfields of maths can be proven complete. And when I look back on it, I think that my grounding for my common sense ideas about what technical logic would be able to do weren't crafted in the world of technical logic, they were crafted in the world of non-technical logic. And likewise, this idea that space-time is definitely going to be Euclidean, that common sense intuition is crafted in the world of middle-sized objects and relatively holds in the world of middle-sized objects and breaks down at the planetary level. Common sense is fine as long as you are dealing with the kind of objects that common sense was crafted in. And oftentimes, that world is significantly less complex than the world as it actually appears. So even when it comes to something like the inner psychology of other people's minds, my common sense beliefs about the inner psychology of other people's minds isn't crafted by looking at their minds or having in-depth conversations about their specific psychology. It's crafted in the world of everyday conversations. So very rarely does it become deep enough to, say, challenge the epistemic warrant of a very acclaimed therapist's case notes or something like that. And I think that's where this worship of common sense is potentially at its most dangerous, is where we are presented with something that superficially looks quite a lot like the domain in which our common sense was forged, but is, upon closer inspection, much more complicated than that. Next, we have a comment by Dante Scalona, and it reads, "Dear Faux Jolly, I hereby dare you to defend Leibniz's theodicy. Undoubtedly, we are living in the best of all possible worlds. You must have seen it coming, of course. Best regards." So I actually do have the Faux Jolly hat, which, for those of you who are new to the channel, is the hat that I wear when I'm kind of defending theism as a kind of character. So, on the one hand, we could just go through Leibniz's defense, because his initial formulation of his theodicy is all about the principle of sufficient reason and various different types of evil, and some evil that he thinks is necessary, so it's unavoidable, but we're still in the best of all possible worlds and all sorts. But in some ways, defending the caricatured version is an awful lot more fun. So, the trouble, of course, with the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds is that on the face of it, we can see all around us that there is preventable evil. So as we're talking now, there will be people dying of malaria in totally preventable ways, and certainly ways that would be preventable for a god. But again, if I'm going to defend this kind of straw version of Leibniz's theodicy, because as I said, it's a lot more fun, I would probably give the Book of Job response. So I have my Bible here. It's the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, which my sister got me for Christmas, which was very kind of her. I like it because it's got thick pages. So many Bibles have really thin pages, which makes them very transportable, but also they just fall apart and it's a real pain. Anyway, I will cut the next bit while I find the Book of Job. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Book of Job, basically a lot of awful things happen to Job, and he puts forth the problem of evil. He talks about how there are wicked men that do well. He talks about how awful things have happened to him in particular. And that's the thing that people often focus on, right? Because lots of Job's children die and all sorts happen. It's a really it's quite a tough read. But it ties into this wider narrative in the Book of Job, which is basically just the problem of evil. And at the end, the Lord answers Job. So this is chapter 38. And in my version, it's entitled The Lord Answers Job. And it reads, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" And it kind of goes on a bit like that. And basically he's saying, come on, Job. I'm God. Who are you to question me? And I still think that this is the best response to the problem of evil. It's not a great response for someone like me who's an atheist. I don't believe in God, so the idea that, it's fine because God exists and he's all-powerful and omniscient and omnibenevolent just doesn't quite sit right with me, because I'm not convinced of the initial premise. But if you are a theist, I think this is a perfectly good response to the problem of evil, because let's say that God does exist, right? And he is so much more wise and powerful and knowledgeable than any of us, then we should kind of expect him to behave in ways that we simply cannot understand. So the example I quite often use is of an ant crawling across the complete works of Shakespeare. It's not even that the ant can't understand the words, although the ant can't. The ant can't even conceptualize the words as words. They are just weird markings. They don't mean anything to the ant. The ant can't even conceptualize what he can't understand about the situation. And I suspect that if God did exist, we would stand in a very similar relation to him, except turned up to 11, right? Because God's an infinite being and we are merely finite beings. And as a result, I think that we sort of should expect that what is the properly best of all possible worlds just won't seem like the best of all possible worlds to us, because we're not infinitely wise and infinitely powerful and infinitely knowledgeable. I kind of think that Leibniz's theodicy, even this caricatured version of it, is easy to mock. And I've kind of poked gentle fun at it in the past, and Voltaire's Candide pokes quite a lot of gentle fun at it, and perhaps less than gentle fun at it. But if you're already enmeshed in a theistic framework, it is a less insensible idea than at least you might first think. It's just that on an everyday basis, it does seem like a very bizarre proposition, because it implies that everything that is bad happens for a reason. We saw that earlier in the video. That is a position that requires you to say things that on the face of it can seem quite heartless. And as an atheist, I would say kind of are less than compassionate. But that's because I don't hold the same worldview. If you are a theist, I think that you can kind of turn to the Book of Job answer. I kind of think that theology regarding the problem of evil, I don't think has got much past that. I still think that's the strongest response to the problem of evil, and it was written however many thousands of years ago. But yes, that is how I would defend Leibniz's theodicy. I ultimately don't think it's defensible, but if you're already a theist, I think that you could get quite a lot of mileage out of it. Our next bad philosophy opinion comes from John Davis 2553, and he's called it Latent Pragmatism. That sense in which people treat successful things as objectively true or real in a sense. For example, Christianity gives people a sense of meaning and purpose and improves relationships and self-esteem, therefore it must be true. When numbers are input in this particular manner, we can consistently predict the pattern of the output. Therefore, numbers are objective and real, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think that people do this. I do see people do this quite a lot in religious conversations, and I always kind of want to pin them down on it, because I think that something can be useful and not true. My classic example of this is assuming that fluids are continuous in fluid dynamics, which we know isn't true because of atomic theory, but nonetheless, it's an incredibly useful assumption. It simplifies a lot of the maths, and it allows you to do fluid mechanics, which is incredibly useful. So I do think that there's a break between utility in the straightforward sense and truth. I think that when theists use an argument like this, they're often trying to suggest that God is fulfilling a deep need inside of us, and the idea that that can't be plugged by anything else is somewhat defeasible evidence for God's existence. So I think at its best, this argument isn't just it's useful, therefore it's true. It's something like the fact that this belief fulfills a particular deep need that, at least on their assumption, can't be filled by anything else, suggests that we are yearning for something beyond our world. If you've got a God-sized hole and literally nothing else can plug it, then maybe that's defeasible evidence that God actually does exist, or at the very least that God is indispensable or something like that. I don't think that it's the strongest argument for God. I also think that it leads to quite a lot of confusion in discussions around God, because, so there are a number of different ways that we use the term truth in ordinary conversation. One of them is what I would call like common or garden truth, which is just a very, very minimal kind of correspondence truth. So, for example, I can say that my copy of Dostoevsky's The Gambler was on my desk, and it was, like, in a really straightforward sense. I had a statement, I had an object in that statement, or a word that corresponded to an object in that statement. I had a positional relation that I described between this object and my desk, which is another object that I can see in front of me. And effectively, the truth maker for that statement is fulfilled by the book being on the desk. However, that's not the only way that people use the term truth. That's the way that, someone like me as a kind of recovering logic student sees truth, right? As in logic, it's the correspondence between a given syntax or a given sentence and a state of affairs in your model. But when people say truth in everyday conversation, especially conversation with a kind of mystic tinge to it, they use metaphors and images that clearly indicate they can't just be talking about this kind of common or garden variety truth. So oftentimes people talk of like higher truths or deeper truths. If you're just using common or garden variety truth, that almost seems like it doesn't make any sense, right? There's nothing about the truth of my book being on the desk that's any deeper than the truth about my desk existing or the truth about certain mathematical theorems being true or something like that. It's all the same kind of truth. Whereas when people are talking in this kind of quasi-mystical sense, I almost think they're just using the word truth in a different way, like something that I certainly wouldn't use the word truth to describe. And I think sometimes the way that they're using true there is much closer to like a sense of what would organize your life the best, or a framework through which you could interpret reality to make it meaningful. And I don't have any problem with somebody arguing for that. I think that the issue comes when an equivocation goes on with the word truth, and they use this mystic truth, for want of a better word, which like I would just call not truth. I would just call that meaning structures or something like that, just because I think otherwise it can get confusing. But let's use that terminology for now. So like this kind of mystic flavored truth is then used to infer things about common or garden truth. That's just an invalid inference. You just can't neatly jump between two definitions of truth in your argument. You're equivocating two unlike terms. So that's roughly what I think is going wrong in that argument. I think that the second example you've given about numbers is quite interesting because it allows you to present a more Steelman version, which is if something is truly indispensable, you cannot get rid of it, then I think that is reason to at least have a justified belief in it, right? So say that we literally could not do without numbers. So for whatever reason, we try to translate our physical theories out of maths and to just cash out all of the mathematical objects that we use into like ordinary physical objects. If it turns out that we literally cannot do that, then there is, I think, a defeasible argument you can make that since it is indispensable in our best understanding of the world, it is kind of just an implication of the theory. This is a variant on an argument variably by Willard Van Orman Quine and Hilary Putnam, and it's often called the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument. And I don't think that argument is ridiculous at all. I think it sits relatively well with me, even if I'm pretty agnostic about whether it actually applies to mathematical objects in particular, because I figure that if you've got this object in your theory and you cannot cash it out as anything else, then you are just already positing that it exists. It is in the bounds of your quantifiers that are intended to describe the world. And so you are, in this very thin sense, committed to its existence. And what the thickness of that existence is will be cashed out further down the line. Okay, next we have a comment from Delusional Guy, and their worst philosophical hot take is, wisdom comes with age. So I think that there are two versions of this idea, and one of them is relatively defensible and the other is totally indefensible. The relatively defensible version is that as you age, you're likely to experience more things. And as a result, you're likely to experience more challenges to your pre-existing belief system. You hopefully have changed your mind a lot more. You know, when I think back to 5 years ago, I think, God, I held so many opinions there, and so many of them, like, I now think are rubbish. And I kind of hope that pattern will continue. And so running this process forward, I imagine that in 5 years, I will think many of the opinions that I hold now are wrong. And hopefully, this is a gradual process of improvement, right? I hope that by the time I'm 70, 75, I will be closer to wisdom than I am now. And so I think that this gives us, again, a kind of defeasible reason to think that age could be correlated with wisdom. Having said that, I've met some very, very, very wise young people. You have lots of wisdom in the poetry of Pushkin, and Pushkin has died very, very young. Albert Camus was still quite young when he wrote The Stranger, and I think that there's a fair amount of wisdom in that text. At the same time, as he got older, he revised his opinions, and you really see that in works like The Plague and the Revel, where he's revisiting the worldview put forward in The Stranger and refining it, and I would argue revising it quite considerably. But nonetheless, the Stranger has quite a lot in it as a text, and Camus wrote it when he was quite young. So I don't think that just because an author is young, that means that they have nothing to say. Although I'm such a biased party here because I'm 25, and so, frankly, what the hell do I know about wisdom? So take all this with a grain of salt. The less defensible version of with age comes wisdom is almost the extreme inference that any person of a certain age is going to necessarily be wise. That's just very unlikely to be true, right? There are plenty of people reach an advanced age without being wise, just as plenty of people reach an advanced age and only grow in their wisdom. Personally, I know quite a lot of older people, people in their 60s and 70s, and some of them are incredibly wise and lend, I think, quite a lot of credence to the idea that age at its best can bring a particular kind of wisdom to it that you might just not get without having lived through an enormous amount of life. But at the same time, there are quite a lot of older people there who perhaps don't have this quality in quite as large quantities. And also lots of them disagree with one another, right? So at the very least, you can't start inferring from the age or even the perceived wisdom of a speaker to the conclusion that what they're saying is necessarily true. That would just be ad hominem in a different guise. So yes, I do think that there is something in perhaps a loose correlation between age and wisdom. Certainly, I don't think that we should go about just ignoring what older people have to say, because I think that life experience can bring extraordinary wisdom. I suppose it's like receiving information from any valuable but fallible source. You use your critical thinking to examine your inputs and decide which of them you're going to take into your own philosophy and which you might want to discard. Next, we have a comment by Fritz Ardude, and their worst philosophy take ever is the classic schoolteacher philosophy of it doesn't matter who started it, you're both in trouble. I think that this does really frustrate kids, especially because it's often used as an excuse to punish, say, both like the bully and their victim when the victim decides to fight back or something like that. However, I wanted to, pick this comment in particular because I've been doing research for a video about moral relativism just as a philosophy, just because it's one of the few philosophies that ends up in kind of the public eye, I suppose. And I think as a result, it would be nice to do a kind of deep dive into, what it is, problems with it, etc., etc., etc. And as a result of this, I've been reading quite a lot of collected anthropological findings on different cultures' ideas of justice or fairness or virtue and things like that. And it was a collection of Sherpas that this one anthropologist looked at, where when there was a dispute between two people, quite often the accuser ended up being punished as well. And I found this very, very strange. And I may just be misremembering this, but the anthropologist was saying, when he talked about this candidly to the more authoritative people in this community, their general argument or underlying ethos behind this was that they all had to live together in close proximity. So the most important thing from a standpoint of social cohesion was that everyone agreed what happened and everyone came away thinking, right, we have a shared view of reality, everything has been made right, and we all now can be friends again. It was largely a restorative function, justice, as opposed to, say, our ideas of justice tend to be around people getting what they deserve. That's like a big pillar of our moral psychology around justice or fairness. And in this case, it just wasn't, because for example, it did no good to the community to give someone what they deserved if all that would do was brew resentment further down the line. And anyway, this led to this situation where until the accuser and the accused could decide on what had happened and kind of come to a shared agreement on what reality was in that disagreement, they would both be punished. So I think they were both beaten in this case. I don't know, that struck me as fascinating. So I suppose if you are in a situation where social cohesion is to be valued above everything else, and you just really do want to have a society where the peace is kept at all costs, then sometimes it does make sense to have this attitude of, I don't care who started it, everyone's being held responsible for it. Or in some ways, everyone is being corralled into the same view of moral reality. I don't know how well this translates into a classroom context, just because I've never had to control a class, but I wonder if that's at least the underlying thought behind this kind of, I don't care who started it, we're all going to sit down and finish it type thing. I don't know, I found it so frustrating at school. So I'm kind of a biased source. But if you were going to construct a defense for that kind of philosophy of justice, I think that's how you probably go about it. Right, that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed it. You can see my other video that's defending bad philosophy takes here, and I'll see you in a couple of months for the next time I do another video like this. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.